This video will serve as part 2 of my upload What Modern Science Doesn't Understand, and should serve to consolidate the ideas presented there. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend watching it first, as I directly reference many of the foundational ideas from it. In brief though, this video will expand upon my critique of the current state of modern science, its ontological and social functions today. And as such, central to my critique is the idea that science is ultimately interpreted, and things which are interpreted are filtered through our current interpretive scheme, or how we are trained to look at something. Now, I would contend that this principle of Gestalt psychology doesn't simply just apply to stage magic and simple optical illusions, but rather these principles apply to complex philosophical notions and elaborate logical structures. And with that in mind, please allow me to introduce Dr. Iain McGilchrist, a cognitive scientist and author of The Master and His Emissary. Dr. McGilchrist has spent over 30 years studying brain lateralization and the function of both hemispheres in relation to us and society. For a long time now, one might say, McGilchrist has been raising the alarm bells that modern man has philosophically and socially engineered ourselves into a cognitive state in which we are increasingly functioning as though we hold brain damage to the right hemisphere. In the following clip, he explains what is, in my mind, pivotal to understanding the present state of modern science. These clips were taken from his presentation at CERN in August of 2023. The link is in the description, and I do highly recommend watching the full video.
Now, as was mentioned by Amir, a central concept for me is attention. When I discovered that one of the most important distinctions between the two brain hemispheres was the way in which they pay attention to the world, it didn't immediately dawn on me why this was so significant, because I had been trained in a mechanistic way of thinking about the brain, which was that attention is just another cognitive function that can be measured in the lab, and it could be simulated by a machine. A machine can be directed towards something, but it can't pay attention to it. And attention is something very special indeed, because I believe it actually creates the world. The only world that any of us can know is the world that comes into being for us. And that world is a combination of something coming from us and something out there. And I believe that this is a two-way relationship. In fact, that all things in the cosmos have two-way relationships, are reverberative in their nature. And I'm trying to get away from naive realism on the one hand and naive idealism on the other. Now, if you apply that across the world, you realize that attention is a creative act. Attention is a moral act, because what you make of the world is something that really comes out. When I attend to you in a certain way, I can bring something that is warm, good, beneficent, perhaps healing, as a good therapist or doctor might be able to do. If I pay attention to you in a clinically detached way, I can make you feel very small, very alien, and so on. We create the world around us. We actually make things through our attention. So how you attend matters, because it forms up like this. Once you start looking in one way, you find only the bits of the world that respond to the way you look. The world is a machine. So you look at it, you find, this is mechanical, that's mechanical, the other's mechanical, the whole thing's a machine. But that's because looking at it as a machine, all you see are the bits that respond to that mechanistic view. And if you do, you then start to look further in this same way, thinking that was a good start. And now you just harden up. So after a few decades, it's very difficult to break out of a habit of mind. This is the kind of attention paid by the left hemisphere, targeted on something. The reason that we have these two hemispheres, you may say, why do we have these two hemispheres? Is because the left is good at one thing only. It's much better than the right at grabbing. at grasping. And even the processes whereby we say we have grasped something, we have begriffen, or indeed comprehendre, comprehender is to grasp hold of, or apprehend is to grasp onto. Comprehend is probably different. It's to sort of see the whole together, which is what the right hemisphere alone can do. But this is how the left hemisphere looks at the world. A leads to B, job done. But the broad view of the right hemisphere sees that A and B are connected, but not as directly as you thought, and that the system is living, hence the birds and the tree, and complex, not just complicated. There are various differences, and one is that the left, I put the left hemisphere version on the left and the right hemisphere version on the right. And in these dichotomies that are somewhat false dichotomies, because nothing can be cut and dried when it comes to anything as complicated as the brain. But nonetheless, there are strong tendencies for the right hemisphere to be able to apprehend new experiences of whatever kind, new music, new person, new shape, whatever it might be. Whereas the left hemisphere latches onto what is already known and familiar, because it's
Now, as McGilchrist explained, modern man exhibits a striking inclination towards the phenomenology of the left hemisphere, at the expense of the right's ability to grasp the totality of the whole, roughly speaking. It's here that I'd like for us to take a look at a particular insight that Einstein offers into the mindset of a physicist. So let's again pick up from where we left off with Einstein. Among the various pictures of the world which are formed by the artist and the philosopher and the poet, what place does the world picture of the theoretical physicist occupy? Its chief quality must be a scrupulous correctness and internal logical coherence, which only the language of mathematics can express. On the other hand, the physicist has to be severe and self-denying in regard to the material he uses. He has to be content with reproducing the most simple processes that are open to our sensory experience, because the more complex processes cannot be represented by the human mind with the subtle exactness and logical sequence which are indispensable for the theoretical physicist. Even at the expense of completeness, we have to secure purity, clarity, and accurate correspondence between the representation and the thing represented. When one realizes how small a part of nature can thus be comprehended and expressed in an exact formulation, while all that is subtle and complex has to be excluded, it is only natural to ask what sort of attraction this work can have. Does the result of such a self-denying selection deserve the high-sounding name of world picture? Einstein does go on to conclude that he thinks it does deserve such a name as world picture. However, in sight of McGilchrist's work, I would submit to you that this world picture, while it does present a useful and reliable map of reality, it is still only one way to apprehend the territory. In sight of Einstein's recognition of the physicist's understandably constrained and careful mode of attention, is it any surprise that the sciences, in following physics, may have perhaps overemphasized a kind of rigid empiricism? Dr. McGilchrist at the beginning of our clip conveys the absurdity of separating philosophy/metaphysics from science. Why did this sort of taboo against metaphysics arise in academia to begin with? Well, I want to draw attention to an aforementioned contemporary of Einstein, the co-author of the Principia Mathematica, the great mathematician and cosmologist Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead expressed a very similar criticism when it came to the rather bizarre divide between metaphysics and science. Indeed, McGilchrist is influenced by Whitehead and has since scientifically verified many of the intuitions of his via the cognitive sciences. I think Whitehead gives us a pretty clear idea of what has long since been going on within academic science in the following quote, which was found in the notes taken during a lecture of his by one of his students. Every scientific man, in order to preserve his reputation, has to say he dislikes metaphysics. What he means is he dislikes having his metaphysics criticized. This quote to me is magical. It conveys, one, that there is a kind of unspoken or unconscious taboo, or a sense of ickiness towards the idea of metaphysics within the walls of academic science. And two, simultaneously conveys that regardless of how you feel about metaphysics in some abstract sense, you still have a metaphysics. You have metaphysical foundations, fundamental assumptions about how reality works. And in some sense, it actually informs your sense perception apparatuses in dissecting and breaking apart reality, in making sense of things. And again, abstracting things away from phenomenal reality is, broadly speaking, the byproduct of the phenomenology of the left hemisphere. In other words, as Whitehead explains in his 1929 work Process and Reality, the point is that every proposition refers to a universe exhibiting some general systematic metaphysical character. Apart from this background, the separate entities which go to form the proposition and the proposition as a whole are without determinate character. Nothing has been defined because every definite entity requires a systematic universe to supply its requisite status. Thus, every proposition proposing a fact must, in its complete analysis, propose the general character of the universe required for that fact. There are no self-sustained facts floating in non-entity. In other words, Whitehead was conveying precisely what McGilchrist has done through the cognitive sciences, namely that you cannot get around dealing with metaphysics. You can try to pretend you don't hold a metaphysics, but you do, you just aren't consciously aware of it. If we fundamentally look at the world as though it is made of things, and these things comprise a mechanism which makes more complex mechanisms, as the left hemisphere tends to prefer, then that contextualization of what we think reality is going to affect how we interpret nature. It's the way we choose to look at the thing. It isn't rooted in empirical evidence or anything of the like. It is a fundamental metaphysical assumption about what reality is. In essence, this mechanistic view of the world is the metaphysics of materialism, or more commonly physicalism today, which is basically the default way we are raised to look at the world these days, as since birth we are raised to contextualize reality in this way. We learn what things are via osmosis or exposure to others. We can choose to look at reality as either discrete or continuous. Indeed, through quantum mechanics, we understand that our shared reality expresses itself through wave-particle duality in some sense. This may postulate two ways of looking at the world, seemingly mirroring the dualistic structure of the universe, which is reflected through the fact that our brains consist of two hemispheres. Even prior to the emergence of quantum field theory, Whitehead was already very much aware of the problems of viewing things in terms of these material mechanisms. I won't go into any detail on his remedy for this issue, mostly because it's beyond the scope of what I want to illustrate here, and for the simple fact that the YouTube channel Formscapes has done a far better job in explaining his metaphysics than I ever could. I've included a link to his video in the description, and I do highly recommend watching it, as it is an extraordinarily fascinating production. Now that we have an understanding of the interpretive nature of science, please allow me to present a further elaboration of a key concept which should help elucidate why scientism is scientism. Namely, that there is no singular science, and at any moment, the thing we call science can come crumbling down, only to be replaced with a new notion or set of ways of looking at the world, which upends our current contextualization of the world. And mind you, in a way that goes far deeper than a mere theory being replaced, as that fails to convey the reality of how science evolves. Greater precision, let's examine what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, which is, in my mind, what we today colloquially identify as the science. Thomas Kuhn, a renowned philosopher of science, introduced the concept in his influential work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in 1962. Kuhn uses the term normal science to refer to the routine work of scientists operating within an established framework of theories and assumptions, which are known as a paradigm. This paradigm guides their research and sets the boundaries within which scientific inquiry occurs. In the phase of normal science, scientists focus on solving specific problems or puzzles that arise within the context of a prevailing paradigm. Their work is largely cumulative and incremental, aimed at extending and elaborating the existing scientific theories rather than challenging or overturning them. They build off of what has come before. They use standardized methods and techniques approved by the scientific community and work towards refining and deepening the understanding of the paradigm. Kuhn posited that normal science plays a crucial role in scientific development by allowing for a focused and detailed exploration within a specific theoretical framework. However, most central to the point I'm attempting to illustrate here, he also noted that this could lead to a resistance to new ideas or anomalies that do not fit in within the existing paradigm. Over time, the accumulation of these anomalies can lead to a crisis, potentially resulting in a paradigm shift, where the old paradigm is replaced with a new one, marking a period of revolutionary science. Now, to expand on Kuhn's ideas with some of our own, we can view an existing scientific paradigm through the metaphor of a tree. Each branch of this tree represents a specific area of scientific inquiry, growing and extending as new discoveries and theories are developed. Just as a living tree may lose branches or grow new ones, our tree of scientific knowledge is continually reshaped by new insights and discoveries. The roots of the tree can symbolize the fundamental principles and assumptions that underpin science, its epistemological, ontological, and metaphysical foundations. These roots provide stability and nourishment and are a necessity for the tree to grow. Each branch represents a different field of study: physics, biology, chemistry, and so on. Smaller branches sprout from these larger ones, symbolizing a specialized area of research. At any given discovery which presents a problem to be solved, or such as one of Kuhn's puzzles, there can be multiple possible solutions to that problem. The scientists which are engaged in that research and peer review tend to ultimately interpret the problem through the lens of what mirrors the whole tree itself. Or one could say it is a puzzle that must be fitted into the whole picture. The result of this is something like several branches splitting off from a parent branch, and one in particular is given the most energy or sunlight, in which that branch can grow larger than the rest of them. The leaves could be seen as individual studies or experiments contributing to the overall health and growth of the branches that they are on, and consequently the tree as a whole. Now, obviously, this tree isn't static. When a new discovery is made, it can be likened to a gust of wind shaking off many branches. Sometimes this leads to a few leaves, individual studies, or theories falling off. Other times, an entire branch might be found unsound and is pruned away, representing a shift in the understanding or the invalidation of a previously accepted theory. Now, at a larger scale, Kuhn's paradigm shift can be understood as perhaps a complete withering away of the tree itself. Normal science rests upon certain assumptions about what reality is and how it works, and if something came along which threatened the health of the whole tree, then, well, the whole tree itself may stand to die, and a new tree sitting nearby may already be primed to replace it. These alternative trees can be thought of as alternative scientific paradigms. So, in an ideal world, we would be quick to shine light upon a new branch when a sibling branch has withered and died. Yet, as Kuhn identified, that doesn't appear to be how science as an institution actually functions in the real world. Actually, it appears to be quite the opposite. The more accepted an idea or paradigm becomes, the more ardently it is defended even in presence of great evidence. And if the entirety of the tree is at stake, then the institutions of normal science may actually go to great lengths to keep that tree preserved, and perhaps even degrade and attack alternative paradigms. As you know, we human beings are emotional creatures, and all rationality has a tendency to go out the window the moment that the entire philosophies, careers, and social orders stand to be affected. And make no mistake, if the tree of normal science is to be cut down, then the consequences are enormous. Now, allow me to provide an example of what I mean by this. On September 16th of 2023, an open letter signed by a group of 124 researchers labeled the Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness as pseudoscience. This letter itself was widely criticized as being, quite frankly, obviously politically motivated. Many reputable figures within the science of consciousness have expressed their disdain for the attribution of the term pseudoscience, and the original article didn't offer any definition for the term. They cited that the core claims of IIT cannot be tested, but yet many claims are perfectly testable and have been tested. By all accounts, this appears to be a stretching of the term so that it might invalidate the credibility of IIT. Now, you might be asking, why would 124 neuroscientists and philosophers sign a letter of this nature? Well, to first provide some background, there is a notion which I alluded to in the intro to this video, which is known as the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers to describe a fundamental dilemma in understanding how and why we have subjective experiences, the rich inner life of sights, sounds, smells, emotions, and thoughts that we each experience privately. Unlike the easy problems of consciousness, which concern how the brain processes stimuli, integrates information, and controls behavior, The hard problem focuses on why these processes should feel like something from the inside. For instance, we can explain how the eyes and brain processes light waves to produce vision, but it remains deeply puzzling why this process should give rise to the vivid experience of seeing colors or feeling warmth. The hard problem questions how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experiences, or qualia, and why these experiences exist at all. The problem is central to the philosophy of mind and consciousness studies, highlighting a gap between our scientific understanding of the brain and the elusive nature of conscious experience. Integrated information theory offers a distinctive approach to addressing the hard problem by proposing a quantifiable and theoretical framework to explain why subjective experiences occur and what they fundamentally are. According to IIT, consciousness arises from the integrated information that a system is able to generate. This means that any system that has a high degree of information integration, where information is not merely present but is combined in a unified whole, has consciousness. This theory attempts to bridge the gap identified by the hard problem by suggesting that the subjective quality of experience, or again, qualia, corresponds to the patterns of integrated information within a system. Most relevant to the point I'm making here, IIT holds philosophical underpinnings which may imply that systems with even minimal levels of integrated information may possess a form of consciousness that aligns with a bottom-up panpsychist ontology. Suggests a continuum of consciousness that extends beyond humans to other living organisms, and possibly even to artificial systems. In this sense, even plants, simple organisms, artificial intelligence, or any interconnected system may have some degree of consciousness. Fortunately for us, we're not left guessing what the motivation for characterizing IIT as pseudoscience is. The letter was so widely criticized that one of the authors, Hoffman, released a follow-up letter to attempt to remedy the situation. In it, he equates IIT as being unscientific, magicalist, and a departure from science as we know it. He admits that the primary reason for the letter was essentially politically motivated. They wanted to reassert control over the cultural narrative. They don't want alternative ontological notions about the nature of reality to supplant the dominant ones which are already believed by the culture at large. How is this claim any more unscientific than the unproven metaphysical presupposition that consciousness is the sole byproduct of neuronal interactions? That it's nothing more than a ghost in a complex clockwork-like machine? This appears as nothing more than I have my own ontological and metaphysical ideas about reality, and you have yours, and I don't like yours. Good science should be philosophically and politically neutral. Why is this paradigm any more unscientific for its philosophical foundations, and the paradigm of normal science not unscientific for its own philosophical foundations? I submit to you, this is the unspoken fiction of modern scientism. This is the enemy of genuine science. Like the priestly authority deciding what notions are acceptable for the masses, they say it out loud in this exact letter. Whereas the Catholic Church may have shunned and potentially burned a heretic at periods in history, the modern equivalent in scientism Is exile from academia, risk to your career, being subtly pushed out of tenure, or when in absence of a good rational argument or critique, derogatorily mocked as a quack, weirdo, or crackpot for merely having alternative maps of the territory? It isn't that there isn't genuine pseudoscience which masquerades as science. There is, but it also isn't to say that there isn't genuine science being attacked for pseudoscientific motivations. This particular letter is just one of many examples, and when you develop an eye for it, it becomes obvious all throughout modern institutional science. Allow me to draw your attention to another example which I feel demonstrates this quite clearly. In October of 2017, an object which had entered our solar system was spotted by the University of Hawaii's Pan-STARRS-1 telescope. This object would later be named Oumuamua, which is Hawaiian for a messenger from afar arriving first. The reason why the name nods to a first arrival is because Oumuamua is actually the first interstellar object that humanity has ever detected in our solar system. Despite not having telescopes powerful enough to make out the definite details, it's believed that the object was shaped like a cigar or a cylindrical-like pancake, and was over 300 feet long. Its trajectory indicated that it had come from another solar system and was traveling through the Milky Way galaxy for hundreds of millions of years before reaching our solar system. By all accounts, Oumuamua has been described as extremely enigmatic because of its unique behavior and appearance. And in November of 2018, Harvard professor Avi Loeb published a paper which hypothesized that Oumuamua could actually be an interstellar light sail. For reasons we'll examine momentarily, a great deal of controversy has been generated surrounding this topic. To help explain why Dr. Loeb's hypothesis should be considered valid, allow me to present someone who is far more educated on these topics than myself. The following clip was taken from the Angry Astronaut, who runs a very fascinating channel covering topics related to astrophysics and astronomy. I highly recommend checking him out, and I've provided a link in the description.
First of all, a quick review of all the unnatural things about Oumuamua. First of all, where did this object come from? Well, as near as we can tell, based on its trajectory before it encountered the sun, Oumuamua was moving through the galaxy at a speed that corresponded to what is called the galactic standard of rest, meaning that it was stationary in relation to the stars moving around it. It was rotating at precisely the same speed as the rate of rotation that the galaxy has in general. That makes it extremely useful for a navigational buoy for starships traveling between the stars who need a fixed point in space to lock onto. Now, this could have happened by chance, but the odds of it happening by chance are 0.2% or 500 to 1. That's the first strange thing about this object. Number two, it was rotating at a very consistent and unchanging speed. This also is not unusual for an asteroid, a comet, or some other object in space. However, as you will see later on, the fact that Oumuamua continued to rotate even when it was accelerating out of the solar system is an extremely unnatural thing for it to do. Also, Oumuamua was highly reflective, an extremely high albedo, unnaturally so for an asteroid or a comet. Now, of course, comets are pretty reflective because they're comprised primarily of ice, but Oumuamua was substantially more reflective than even the average comet, looking more metallic than ice-like. Nevertheless, there are objects in the solar system that are about as reflective as Oumuamua, so that's not necessarily that unusual. Also, its length compared to its width and its thickness is highly unusual. At best, Oumuamua is a flat pancake-like object. Once again, if comprised of hydrogen and ice and perhaps nitrogen, that sort of thing, as many astronomers have theorized that it's comprised out of in order to back up their explanations as to how Oumuamua accelerated out of the solar system without any visible means of doing so. Well, how the hell did something this thin and with this low of a boiling point survive a close encounter with the sun? Oh yeah, and that's something else we need to cover. The fact that Oumuamua passed through the solar system on the trajectory that it did. Keep in mind, Oumuamua could have passed through the solar system at any point, theoretically. All of this was purely by chance, and yet it passed so close to the sun, within the orbit of Mercury. Again, a very unusual thing for it to do, and on its way out, it was less than 2/10 of an astronomical unit away from Earth. Closer to Earth than any planet in the solar system gets, even at its closest approach. And here's the strangest detail of all, as I have alluded to throughout this video. On its way out of the solar system, Oumuamua began to accelerate non-gravitationally with no visible means of propulsion. Now, comets commonly change their trajectories and velocities because of cometary outgassing, as ice is converted into a gas by the sun's heat and outgasses, as we have seen with a comet that's recently been passing through our solar system this year. However, Oumuamua demonstrated no visible outgassing whatsoever. We had some of the most advanced telescopes on the planet trained on it the entire time, and we saw no evidence whatsoever of any cometary outgassing. Not only that, you remember I talked about the rotation before? Well, any cometary outgassing, especially that caused this big of a change in velocity, should have changed the rotational speed of the object. It should have modified it to some degree, and yet it didn't. Oumuamua continued to rotate at the same speed, the same rate, unchanged in spite of its strange acceleration. All of these things are completely unnatural. And yet, at the beginning of this year, a paper was released by a pair of astronomers who argued that a cometary object, when subjected to galactic cosmic rays for 100 million years, would produce enough molecular hydrogen freed from water ice, that is to say, hydrogen on its own over the course of 100 million years of galactic cosmic ray bombardment, whereby when the object actually passed through the solar system and in close proximity to the sun, that molecular hydrogen was released and produced the observed acceleration. We couldn't see the hydrogen being released because our instruments were not designed to pick up hydrogen on its own. There were many problems with this theory. First of all, they didn't explain why the rotation didn't change in spite of this massive outrush of hydrogen. We're talking a lot of hydrogen in order to be able to produce the observed acceleration. On top of that, any sort of outgassing of that magnitude should have also carried a fair amount of the object with it. In other words, there should have been debris traveling out of Oumuamua in addition to the hydrogen. No such debris was observed. They didn't explain that either. Dr. Avi Loeb brought up these problems in a paper of his own. However, the media completely ignored Dr. Loeb and proclaimed this new theory as the valid explanation as to what Oumuamua actually was, because after all, Dr. Loeb is a nut job who believes in aliens. However, on November 29th of this year, another paper was released by Niels Ligertink, who's a physical chemist who studies the behavior of various elements in space. He crunched a lot of numbers, the same types of numbers that the original astronomers did, and discovered that even after 100 million years, cosmic ray bombardment of Oumuamua would not have produced enough molecular hydrogen to produce the observed acceleration. Indeed, even after 500 million years, the numbers simply don't add up. For one thing, the object loses molecular hydrogen even in interstellar space, almost as fast as it is produced. On top of that, cosmic rays don't pierce that deep into an object, especially an object made out of ice. Therefore, only the upper layers would have been converted into molecular hydrogen, and that simply would not have produced enough molecular hydrogen in an object the size of Oumuamua. He crunched the numbers over and over again and discovered that even after billions of years, most probably, enough molecular hydrogen would not have been created by this process to produce the observed acceleration. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that he thinks that Oumuamua is an alien object. Rather, he thinks that it's an object that's comprised out of a highly complex collection of chemicals, perhaps a fragment of a piece of a planet of some kind. A planet similar to Pluto with a lot of nitrogen in it, and perhaps it was nitrogen outgassing that created the acceleration. Although the notion of a nitrogen iceberg was debunked years ago, so it would have to be something comprised of a unique collection of chemicals. Very strange, though, that an outgassing of this collection of chemicals would only produce acceleration with invisible gases and not with some sort of gas that we could detect. Very interesting and fortunate coincidence indeed that something like that would happen, and also not impact the rotation of the object in the process. The fact of the matter is, all natural explanations for Oumuamua continue to fall flat, and yet the media continues to not acknowledge this fact. So what was Oumuamua?
The reception of Loeb's article by the scientific community was largely passed over, and despite Loeb's well-reasoned arguments, many of which still hold valid today, the community essentially rejected Loeb's artificial explanation in favor of a natural one. Now, in one regard, that's perfectly normal and to be expected. Our current ideas, our current map of phenomenality, has yet to show any signs of extraterrestrial life. And indeed, it would seem quite odd if suddenly we discovered extraterrestrial life not afar in some distant galaxy, but literally within our own solar system. Yet, in another regard, the map is not the territory, and one would expect good science to not exhibit ontological bias and examine both avenues equally. However, that doesn't appear to be what happened here in this particular instance. The central question here is, at what point does such an impulse become irrational? And how would we recognize when we're actually bending over backwards to justify a prosaic explanation that is in accordance with our map of the territory? Naturally, this paper garnered quite a bit of attention from the media, because prior to this paper, Dr. Loeb was actually something of a well-respected scientist. At this point, Dr. Loeb began speaking with journalists and expressed some of his frustration with his colleagues for not having taken this line of inquiry seriously enough, as he felt there should be sufficient reason to consider this explanation. How did the scientific community respond at large? Well, I submit to you, how would the Catholic Church respond in the face of someone undermining the credibility of the institution?
So, Avi, I get a little bit pissed off when you throw the entire scientific culture under the bus, because some of us have been thinking about and building instruments to find anomalies for a very long time. And I think that when we say that if we ever are going to announce such a detection, that we require extraordinary evidence, we're doing that as a way of differentiating ourselves from the pseudoscience that is so much a part of popular culture. with UFOs and all kinds of claims of things that people have detected. So
Okay.
I wouldn't be so hard on the whole culture, Abby.
It's the first thing we've seen just jump into our solar system, and it's very, very, very exciting. However, if you're the head of the astronomy department at Harvard, a tenured Harvard professor, it's not a comet. It's not of natural origin. It's alien technology. This is another video about crackpots.
Very sound scientific solution that does not involve aliens. But before I start, I actually wanted to briefly mention why we had this controversy and this unusual debate about the origins of this object. And without going into details about the object itself, the only reasonable explanation I see to all of this is, well, unfortunately, for the lack of better words, scientific ego.
You sure about that? You sure about that?
The idea of wanting to be that one scientist discovering something absolutely extraordinary somewhere out there and being that first person to mention it, to provide proof for it, and to then basically be in a spotlight because of this. Now, unfortunately, in science, this happens quite a lot. And also, unfortunately, in science, because of this, there are two main problems. One of the main problems with this is that eventually this causes the public to lose faith and to lose any kind of confidence in scientific discoveries, in the scientific community, and in scientists in general.
No, Anton, as a scientifically illiterate member of the public who can't think for himself, allow me to be the first to say that what harms trust in science is institutional dogma, not somebody who makes a claim that turns out to be wrong. People are aware that science can turn out wrong.
Second of all, the problem with this mentality is that this creates a kind of a race to try to be that one person to discover something incredible so that you can be in the spotlight. Which also often ends up in people making a lot of mistakes in the process and then basically becoming a kind of a pariah or just losing their job completely.
Well, how do you distinguish an individual that is working for personal egotistical motivations and an individual who has a genuine philosophic disagreement with institutional science writ large? Those last two clips were taken from two popular science communicators, and I feel they succinctly display the point. Mind you, I was very meticulous in my examination of their arguments to see if they actually went on to steelman why Dr. Loeb thinks the artificial origin is a valid hypothesis, and neither of them did. Instead, they merely cite the nitrogen outgassing hypothesis, which we know is essentially an invalid explanation. Roman Rafikov, a researcher at Cambridge, has actually acknowledged that if trapped gas were responsible for the object's acceleration, then it would have led to a dramatic change in the rate at which the object was spinning. Rafikov said that he was very suspicious of such outgassing theories, yet bizarrely added that nonetheless, he preferred an explanation that does not involve aliens or divine forces. Yes, he actually equated the extraterrestrial hypothesis with divine forces such as the gods themselves. Thinking about this neutrally, when all natural hypotheses have been exhausted, then yes, artificial origins are indeed on the table, as they are the only currently viable explanations. The disagreement here, to me, it seems, is less so scientific, more so philosophical in nature. Proponents of today's dominant paradigm of science are often quick to cite Karl Popper's philosophy, which holds that science does not operate via positive verification, but rather via falsification or post-positivism. Given that all natural origins have been shown to be inadequate or have been rendered falsified, why does the scientific community and the scientific communicators at large act as if an artificial explanation isn't on the table? More so, it's deeply concerning to me that people think it's acceptable to essentially slander Dr. Loeb as a crackpot and misrepresent his views. If we categorically separate Loeb's Oumuamua hypothesis from his criticism of academic science, and then investigate the nature of his criticism, I think we find that Loeb's disagreement is one of genuine philosophic difference. Therefore, one would expect a respectable and philosophically mature institution to philosophically engage with the merits of Dr. Loeb's perspective, rather than engaging in a manipulative and derogatory method of dismantling Dr. Loeb's personality. I can think of nothing more damaging to the reputation of the empirical sciences than this kind of behavior being exemplified by institutional science and condoned by it as a whole. Whenever any given institution rejects an opportunity for graceful and fastidious introspection, and instead opts to lash out in a violent, juvenile, and reactionary manner, it can be taken as a sign that it has become deeply entrenched in the governance of worldly affairs. Governments resort to censorship and deception when their institutional power is threatened, and human beings under such circumstances become incredibly irrational. Again, I implore you to consider the previous letter on IIT, its openly admitted acute mission statement, and the political entanglement of such a panpsychist view of consciousness, which might have an impact on, for example, Planned Parenthood, or the development of artificial intelligence. Whether people like it or not, the sciences are deeply entangled with politics, because when the populace has come to mistake the map which it presents for the territory itself, it is corollary to state that the science then becomes the ultimate arbiter of truth, in a way which is resemblant of the Christos, which was represented within a deeply psychical or mythopoetic language, the ultimate ideal of truth. As I mentioned in my previous video, understanding the difference between science and scientism is what was supposed to prevent institutional science from becoming a papal authority in a liberal democracy. I want to be clear, whether or not Oumuamua is the byproduct of an alien civilization is irrelevant here. It very well could be a natural object of some kind, but this is not the real scandal here. I'm not suggesting that there is some consciously explicit institutional agenda against aliens, though I don't rule it out, but what I am suggesting is that simply attempting to shift the philosophical window of institutional science is enough to attract the ire of Sauron. That, fundamentally, is what Dr. Loeb appears to have done. He has damaged the faith in the map, which Scientology would have us act as though it is one-to-one with the territory. It seems to me that this bizarrely motivated institutional dogma and stigma against such topics is behind the frustration that Dr. Loeb has expressed, and not some petty egotistical motivation or a desire for personal enrichment like many have accused him of. Rather, it seems to me that his sociocultural criticisms of modern institutional science actually struck a chord, and now he's being castigated for it.
More than a decade ago, scientists identified and described a novel disease known as Nobelitis, in which some Nobel laureates may consider that their award is a certificate of competence in any field, prompting them to undertake projects or accept positions which are beyond their capabilities. The case studies are as numerous as they are devastating. Linus Pauling thought that vitamin C could cure schizophrenia. James Watson thinks white people are genetically superior to other races. And of course, the winner of the 1973 Nobel Prize in Physics, Brian Josephson, thinks homeopathy is real. Remember homeopathy? Yeah, me too. At this point, the question isn't whether or not Nobelitis is a real problem, but whether or not we should change the name in order to be more inclusive of scientists who have achieved a high level of fame and then go on to exhibit symptoms of the disease despite having never won a Nobel. On that note, today I'd like to talk about Avi Loeb.
Oh, yes, let us categorically predispose our audience to view this man as a white supremacist or a homeopathist.
The director of the Institute for Theory and Computation at the Center for Astrophysics at Harvard University, and noted crank who keeps appearing on my social media timeline like he's an ad for Cheech and Chong's new CBD gummies. So, yes, Loeb is a very accomplished theoretical physicist who has authored many respected papers on topics like black holes and exoplanets. He's been at Harvard since 1993, and as these things often go in academia, that usually means he's going to be there until he dies. Unless, somebody catches him fully making up fraudulent data, that is, I guess. Maybe. That hasn't happened yet.
Well, what is the reason for such an uncharitable take, such as throwing the man's intellectual integrity in question? Anybody who's looking at this non-ideologically should be able to get a genuine sense of where he's coming from.
He has written extensively about his obsession, Oumuamua, the first confirmed interstellar object we've observed passing through our solar system. It was first identified in 2017, but unfortunately it was already on its way out of town, so scientists had very little time to collect as much data as possible. What scientists were able to learn is still pretty impressive, but there was this unavoidable vacuum of information that made it tempting to wonder if this mysterious object from outside our solar system was really a rendezvous with Rama kind of situation, an alien craft speeding past us, or just a piece of alien technology hurtling through space for millions or billions of years. Even the astronomers studying this object had that initial giddy thought because scientists are humans and the idea of there being an alien civilization out there is cool as hell. And so researchers like Jason Wright, director of the Penn State Extraterrestrial Intelligence Center, have spent a lot of time going over the evidence for and against a natural origin for Oumuamua, and with some measure of disappointment, they have found that it is overwhelmingly in favor of not aliens.
The truth factor of a claim is not dependent upon consensus. It is dependent upon a unique methodological investigation of each individual involved, and each individual holds a different set of philosophical presuppositions. This is noted in the particular article invoked here, that the conversation largely centers around a meta-discussion. To the majority of scientists involved here, they tend to default to Carl Sagan's epistemological maxim of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There are indeed merits to this kind of epistemology. There are pros and cons to it as well. We shouldn't presume to think that this has been decided upon scientific grounds. This has been decided rather on philosophical grounds. The problem with the aforementioned maxim is that ultimately what you consider extraordinary is a subjective value call. It's dependent on your current ontological map of reality. If you are somebody who has a rigid empiricist epistemology, then chances are you don't think very highly of the many claims which have been going on over the past century, if not longer. Yet even so, there is no shortage of paranormal and anomalous phenomena that is continuously reported by very reliable, rationally thinking individuals. At a certain point, it actually requires a kind of hubris, arrogance, or willful ignorance to actually ignore the massively significant pile of, yes, non-scientific evidence that has accumulated in society. We create our map of the territory, And as such, we tend to ignore whatever phenomena doesn't make any sense to us, which we cannot make sense of. It's a terrifying notion, but sometimes reality is terrifying. It isn't at all clear to me that a good scientist is somebody who rejects the entire broader view of reality for a strict, rigid mindset which encapsulates their entire philosophy. Rather, I would have scientists inhabit a mindset similar to Avi Loeb or Albert Einstein, who expressed that the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. Nobody is saying that wacky out there ideas shouldn't be reined in with empirical evidence. But take this too far to this extreme and you end up with an entire new set of problems.
And yet, Avi Loeb published many papers arguing the opposite, forcing the experts in the field to repeatedly counter his points. As always, links to everything I talk about are in the transcript, linked below in the description, so feel free to click through if you would like to read the full explanation. But just to keep things brief once again, Oumuamua's shape, albedo, which is the amount of light it reflects, its acceleration, its speed, its trajectory, they're all easily explained as a natural object, matching those that astronomers have been observing for decades, despite what Loeb claimed.
Respectfully, the notion that these things are easily explained seems a massive mischaracterization. As somebody who's now read the article twice over, one can easily take away the following statement that, yeah, we don't really know what it is, it's kind of weird, but we think it's probably got to be something natural for X, Y, and Z. To which Avi Loeb would respond, fair enough, but I think it's probably artificial for X, Y, and Z. Ergo, the point that it is not clear one way or the other. It is fundamentally a philosophical disagreement.
Seeing more and more headlines and social media posts about how a noted Harvard astrophysicist is endorsing weirder and weirder things. All of which brings me to this very week, just before I recorded this video, when I saw this post from PZ Myers about how Loeb is now attacking the field of geology.
Is he attacking it, or is he simply submitting new ideas and that is being interpreted as an attack?
He's turned his attention to the Permian-Triassic extinction, aka the Great Dying, Earth's largest known extinction event that occurred 251.9 million years ago to the day, if you can believe it, and which, due to it being so far in the past, is still a bit of a mystery. That said, geologists have formed a consensus that it likely occurred thanks to volcanic eruptions. But in a recent Medium post, Loeb dismisses that consensus as popular opinion and instead posits that the Great Dying was actually due to global warming caused by an ancient, technologically advanced civilization that also left behind UFOs as functional relics that still zip around despite the destruction of said civilization. I say this with all sincerity. Is Avi Loeb okay? It's perfectly cool for someone who excels in one field to take an interest in another field. It's less cool for them to ignore the experts in that field, and it's very uncool to grab headlines that end up tarnishing the reputation of the experts in that field.
In what way is writing a Medium article which speculates on an alternative hypothesis tantamount to tarnishing the reputation of these individuals? The public can think for themselves, and it could only be viewed in this way if you think that the people should be told what to believe by the experts. There is a difference between being informed by the experts and being told what to believe by the experts. Again, this difference is the difference between genuine science and scientism. The sign of a truly rationally thinking individual. I'd rather listen to the evidence given by geologists than the weird-ass speculations of a weird-ass physicist. Have you considered listening to them both and sorting through them respectively?
But when that person starts spinning off into whole new fields and throwing out ideas that sound like they were rejected by the writers of season 5 of Sliders, it might be time for that person's friends, family, colleagues to get together and start having some serious conversations. Just throwing that out there.
Mind you, there is a significant plurality of people that actually believe in UFOs and UAP. Perhaps rather than condescension and feigned concern, maybe an open-minded exploration into what kind of philosophy leads men of science like Dr. Avi Loeb, Dr. Gary Nolan, Dr. Michio Kaku, and Jacques Vallée into such fringe areas of rational inquiry. If there is a rare recurrent phenomena of any nature which is difficult to isolate, test, and reproduce, then surely it is going to fall outside of the purview of what these sciences can measure. However, simply because a tentative phenomenon is difficult to empirically test does not mean that said phenomena isn't potentially real and worth inquiry. Despite what modern institutional science would seemingly have people believe, the general populace is not stupid or incapable of logical thought. Rather, as per McGilchrist, there seems to be an increasingly concerning symptom within institutional science, one which forsakes the broader picture for a map which is highly abstracted away from phenomenal reality. Broadly speaking, people have a good instinct or intuition and can tell when something doesn't add up. It takes a modern scientific disciplinarian way of looking at the world to shut down that right hemisphere, and as Einstein wrote, become so careful and scrupulous in breaking down reality. I would contend Dr. Loeb is simply a scientist thinking normally and freely, as natural selection appears to have intended for us. I submit to you that the universe does not care about what appears weird to us, or whether or not we can rationalize and make sense of it within the contextualization of our current map of reality. Rather, it demands we mold our understanding to be in accord with it, and therefore an ontological neutrality is imperative for the advancement of our knowledge. Again, do not mistake the map for the territory. This is what I meant earlier when I introduced the notion that there must be a higher value placed on the totem pole, or in other words, an animating ethos which is placed above the science. As Jonathan Pageau conveyed, there are many goods which must be sorted through and weighed via our own subjective values. In the hypothetical of an emerging scientific paradigm replacing an older, perhaps more obsolete paradigm, we must weigh the many ramifications of such a monumental change. We must weigh the consequences on people's careers, on foregone advancements in medicine via existing paradigm, the potential social undertaking of re-educating people of a new contextualization of reality. Indeed, even the potential psychogenic effects of an ontological shock that such a change might have on the world if the change in perspective is that grand. I think there is profound truth in Jonathan Pageau's proclamation. Though all those things are good, they should never be treated as the supreme good, lest they become idols and gods that will tyrannize us. There are so many countless factors that may remain on the periphery of consciousness that may be subliminally affecting our decision to uphold the existing map, even when under effective assault from alternative paradigms. In fact, it appears that the nature of mistaking the map for the territory is that it imposes upon us the inability to even recognize the failures of the map. Again, as Iain McGilchrist explains, if you've mistaken the map for the territory for most of your life, it's incredibly difficult to recontextualize things from a new perspective. I want to leave you with a metaphor which I feel drills this point home, one which was adapted from the ideas of Professor Donald Hoffman. Now imagine you are driving a vehicle with no windows, and the only thing you have to know what the outside world is like are the screens and digital instruments that give a representation of what's around you. Imagine that you've lived your entire life in this vehicle and have only ever known the outside world through these digital instruments. Would you know how to make sense of it if suddenly you bumped into what we might call an invisible tree? How would you make sense of that? What would that look like in real terms? How would we know how to recognize when we are bumping into our own invisible trees? Well, when faced with such abnormalities, it is my deep suspicion that we typically respond something like this.
Doesn't look like anything to me.
But where is she? Doesn't look like anything to me.